it was easy to conceptualize what aging is as the accumulation of self-inflicted damage throughout life that eventually becomes too abundant for the body to tolerate. So that's when you start to go downhill functionally. And I was the first person to come along and realize that actually there's this other approach, this third approach of letting the damage be created by metabolism, because we've got no choice, but then repairing the damage before it becomes sufficiently abundant to be pathogenic. What gets me out of bed in the morning is the humanitarian benefit of my work. The fact that 100,000 people, 110,000 people die every day worldwide from age-related problems, and most of them die after a long period of suffering. And I seem to be, making a difference to that. These medicines, when they come along, are going to change that very abruptly. People who are in their 30s or 40s or 50s are going to suddenly go from one day thinking they're going to live to 90, and the next day they're going to realize that they've got a good chance of living indefinitely.
Hi, my name's Liz Parrish, and this is my host, Sarah Vaughan, and this is the Buyingtime podcast. Today, we are really excited to have Dr. Aubrey de Grey with us. Aubrey de Grey is a visionary biomedical gerontologist. He's an author, and we're going to actually put down below the links to the books that Aubrey has written. He's a fellow of several aging associations around the world. He's on the board of a multitude of companies in the longevity space, including mine. And he's actually been at the very forefront and founded multiple nonprofits that are basically doing research on aging and what aging is. And his most latest endeavor is called LEV, or Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation. So today, we're so excited to have him. Thank you for being here today with us, Aubrey.
Well, you're very kind, Liz. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, so now we are trying to reach out to new audiences because we just want to spread health and happiness and an awesome, long, prosperous future to a multitude of people who know nothing about it. And when they go looking for you, they're going to find you everywhere. So could you please tell us how you got started in the aging space?
Sure, yeah. So I actually was not something that I chose as my first career. I originally started out in artificial intelligence research, and I switched careers into biomedical gerontology around the age of 30. And that was because I met and married a biologist in 1990, 91, that, who was on sabbatical in Cambridge. She's a lot older than me. And over the first few years of our marriage, naturally, I learned a bunch of biology over the dinner table, and I also met a bunch of biologists. And gradually, after a couple of years, it began to dawn on me that we were never talking about aging, which I realized was crazy, because I had known since my earliest years that aging is obviously the biggest problem in the world, the one that causes the greatest amount of suffering. And so I started asking questions, and the conversation would go something like, well, like, you don't seem to be interested in aging. And she would say, no, I'm not. And I would say, why not? And she would say, well, it's just decay, isn't it? What fundamental truths about the universe are you going to discover by studying decay? And I would say, well, I kind of know that. But the thing is, it's bad for you. And she would say, well, that's not my problem. And I would say, well, it kind of is. And that would be as far as we would get. So eventually, after another couple of years, probably 94, 95, I really, bit the bullet and decided, well, okay, if all the biologists I'm meeting have this attitude that, aging is not the problem, then I better do it myself, really. So that's how I switched fields, and here I am.
Was there any information in aging? I mean, what was happening at the time?
There were, but that's not quite how I went about things. Honestly, until quite a small number of years before I moved into aging, there were not really any such islands even. Basically, everyone had given up on the idea of doing anything about aging. There were sometimes I compare gerontologists of that era to seismologists. They know that the thing they study is bad for you, but they have no aspiration to actually ever, making it not happen. And so I thought, well, that won't do. But a couple of years before I got into the field, there was a huge breakthrough by Cynthia Kenyon. who was able to double the lifespan of nematode worms. It was published in 1993. And in fact, it wasn't quite the first time that it had been done. An only slightly less impressive result was obtained about 5 years earlier by Tom Johnson's group in Colorado. But anyway, this really shook the field to its foundations because this was supposed not to be possible, to have one gene, one mutation that would make such a difference. In retrospect, well, people shouldn't have been surprised as they were, but one way or another, anyway, what this meant was that suddenly a whole bunch of different techniques became available to study aging and to manipulate aging and to test hypotheses and so on. So a lot of youngsters came into the field, very bright people, and it became, a very respectable field during the late 90s, as opposed to a kind of haven of mediocrity that it had the reputation for being prior to then. That was all very well. That was fantastic. But actually, to be perfectly honest, still most people, in fact, basically everybody, was looking at the problem in the wrong way. They were not looking at it as an engineering problem of trying to keep a machine, functioning properly beyond the time frame that it was built to last, which is essentially what this is all about. And so I was unsatisfied with that, and I did a lot of reading and going to conferences and so on outside of gerontology per se, and that was what allowed me that very broad knowledge of what was going on to have, I guess, the substrate to be able to put everything together into this big package called the sense concept in the year 2000.
Your book Ending Aging was amazing. What made you go down that route? Because that's a very difficult thing. I mean, I think it's easy for people now with the hallmarks of aging paper and the newer ones and everything to say, oh, it's all these things. But when there's no roadmap, how do you start to build a roadmap?
The dissection of aging into these 7 big categories of damage and the corresponding ways to repair that damage or to eliminate it, that was the easy part. The hard part was thinking that damage repair was the way to go at all, because it was easy to conceptualize what aging is as the accumulation of self-inflicted damage throughout life that eventually becomes too abundant for the body to tolerate, so that's when you start to go downhill functionally. People didn't actually tend to describe aging that way. If you would ask experts to define aging, they wouldn't give a definition like that, but they wouldn't disagree with that definition either. So that was the definition that I kind of gravitated to. And having done that, it became rather straightforward to see that there were these 3 paradigms that one might approach the problem with. Indeed, where the goal is to make metabolism not eventually make us sick. One is to basically address the pathologies of late life individually in the same way that we address infections or whatever. And that's very clearly not working. You just can't make it work. The thing is, the people in the field had understood that for nearly a century by the time I came along. The reason why the field of gerontology was even created in the early 20th century was because of the realization that that's not going to work. But then the second way, which is what everyone gravitated to, was to try to somehow appeal to the natural world and to try to slow down the rate at which damage is created. In other words, to make the body run more cleanly. On account of the fact that we see in nature a very big diversity of rates of aging, rates of damage accumulation. Unfortunately, that doesn't work either, because basically we're already really good at it, so there's not really any animals that we can, or hardly any, that we can look to in some way emulate. But worse than that, the creation of damage is so really inextricably intertwined with the things that metabolism needs to do to keep us alive, that, stopping damage from being created is basically a non-starter. And that's why everyone had basically given up by the time I came along. In fact, really starting from the 60s or so, people had more or less decided, okay, this is just not going to happen. And I was the first person to come along and realize that actually there's this other approach, this third approach of letting the damage be created by metabolism, because we've got no choice, but then repairing the damage before it becomes sufficiently abundant to be pathogenic. And this was something that had just completely passed everybody by. So once I got that far, yes, of course, it had to be fleshed out into a number of categories, ideally a nice manageable number like seven, of types of damage that could each be addressed by some kind of plausible damage repair modality. But as I say, because I had um, delved quite a lot into quite diverse areas of biology that were not normally thought of as relevant to aging, that turned out to be the easy part. I could just say, oh, wait a minute, hang on, we might be able to do this to fix that. We might be able to do this to fix that. And literally, it took an hour in the middle of the night, one day in July in 2000 in Los Angeles.
Now, this reminds me of uh, how periodic table was made. I think he went into his room at night, and by the time he came back in the morning, the periodic table was done. I never knew this part of Aubrey's story, that he got this 7 points charted out in one night. I
Yeah,
remember that he turned 60 this year. Did you already turn 60, Aubrey? Or are you going to turn 60?
yeah, 11 days ago.
Wow. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you. I think that I can't wait for the future, because in the future, like how many years we have on us, I think is going to be highly honored. It's not, for women, they say, "Oh, don't ever say your age." I say my age all the time because I'm hoping to double it, triple it. I would love to. And I mean, I'm here. I'm alive. The alternative is crap, you know?
From what Aubrey was saying, he's one person who's in this a longevity community who lives very, very differently. He lives as if, hey, I don't care what happens to my state of my body. I don't much worry about how healthy I am. And he was on podcast where he said he drinks what, 4 beers a day on an average. No, he lives as if he could reverse the aging sometime in the future. That's a very interesting point of view, which most of the people don't do that.
Yeah, no, I have to push back on that a bit. So, I do indeed eat and drink what I like, and I don't even do much exercise, but that's not because I don't care about my health, not at all. It's just because I'm lucky. And, yeah, I can eat and drink what I like and not exercise, and basically nothing happens. But I pay quite a lot of attention to to my health. And, as time goes on, I imagine that, there will be things that I have to pay more attention to over the next decade or two or three, and I shall certainly do so.
What are those things that you pay attention to, Aubrey? What do you consider to be worth paying attention to?
So, of course, every person is different. This is one of the most important things to understand about metabolism, is that you cannot generalize, other than, pay attention to your body. So, for example, if this or that aspect of my micronutrient levels in my blood, start to get out of whack and be, persistently out of whack, that would be a reason to take supplements, for example, or if I start putting on weight, that would be a reason to eat less or to exercise more or something.
But if you could right now do any therapy, or you needed to do a longevity therapy, what would you do?
I really wouldn't do anything today. I mean, of course, the question you're asking has some ifs in it, right? So I think at this point, each individual has to look at each of the potential modalities, whether it's lifestyle or diet or gene therapies or cell therapies. They have to look at all of those things and ask, how much do I need this thing? And the goal, of course, is for all of these things to be safe and effective as preventative measures, so that they can be applied to people who are like me and you, who are not yet sick. But as of now, all of these things are very experimental, and therefore they are improving all the time, both in safety and in efficacy, as well as, of course, things like cost and convenience. And as such, everything has to be looked at as a kind of arms race between the improvements in the therapies and the advancing needs for the therapies. So actually, there is one example for myself, which I can be explicit about, which is presbyopia. I am definitely not as able to see things close up as I used to be. So that's, obviously a standard aspect of aging. And there's a rather good way to treat it. It's called LASIK. But I haven't done that yet. And fundamentally, the reason I haven't is because LASIK keeps getting better. And, it's not that and my eyesight is not getting worse at a particularly problematic rate. So I'm watching those two curves as they go, and there will be some point, perhaps in the next 5 years, when I do get LASIK done. But that's how I will decide when.
And you're saying like if you saw any like indicative markers now, you would work on diet and exercise first if you had to. And then if you had a disease specific, let's say your liver or your pancreas, then you would suss out what technology that was. So you're really tackling things one at a time, but as technology proves itself to be safer, then you would then preemptively take the technology.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's not just having a problem, whether it's in the eyes or the liver or anything. It's how rapidly the problem is getting worse relative to how rapidly the treatments for it are getting better.
I have a point to add about your presbyopia, Aubrey. There are a couple of
Yeah.
things that can help. One is a lot of amino acids that could, to some extent, delay it by a couple of years or so. Another thing is there is a doctor that we met from Belgium. He uses growth hormone therapy around eye socket, which helps temporarily delaying presbyopia. What do you think about treatments like this, in your opinion?
So I have not heard of the idea of using growth hormone local to the eye. That's interesting, and I will be interested to understand it better. Of course, there's plenty of studies about growth hormone more systemically. But yeah, I mean, these are the kinds of things, things like this crop up constantly, right? Not just talking to the right podcaster, but actually, things come out in the published literature, new things all the time. So I'm always on the lookout for everything like that. However, I think there's one thing I really need to emphasize, because we've been talking about my health a lot. I don't actually think about my own health all that much. I certainly don't think about it not at all the way you were suggesting originally, but it's not what gets me out of bed in the morning. What gets me out of bed in the morning is the humanitarian benefit of my work. The fact that 100,000 people, 110,000 people die every day worldwide from age-related problems, and most of them die after a long period of suffering. And I seem to be, making a difference to that. I seem to be able to bring forward the defeat of aging. Who knows how much I'm bringing it forward relative to, how things would be if I spent my life on the beach.
Aubrey, what do you love about life?
I love an awful lot of things about life, actually. I have an extraordinarily privileged life. First of all, partly because of my success in my work, but not only for that reason, I have friends all around the world who are, amazing people. I am an extremely loved person, if you like. Secondly, I live in a wonderful place in the mountains to the south of the Silicon Valley. It's just an extraordinarily tranquil, calming place to be, and I just love being here. Everything about my life that really defines its quality. It's what's in it is just right. It could not be better. I'm just an extremely lucky guy.
I also heard you talk about it earlier, Aubrey, about how people instinctively resist the idea of longevity to a point where, on one hand, they keep fighting all through to live longer. On the other hand, they are fighting the idea of living longer. How do you deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, the cognitive dissonance around this that is so ubiquitous in society is something that struck me as soon as I started talking to people about aging in the mid-90s. And I call it the pro-aging trance, where people hold transparently, like such obviously mutually contradictory opinions, just as you've just described, and yet they can't get out of it. They just can't find a way to understand that these things are contradictory. And so, a lot of my work, of course, is not just science, but advocacy, getting people to wake up from that trance. It's very hard. But yeah, I mean, the reason it's hard is also something that I've understood for a long time, namely that everyone knows that aging's extremely ghastly, and that they come from a long line of death, as Norm Macdonald put it. In other words, people don't know what to do about it. Until very recently, really until I came along, there was no plan even. There was no idea how we would ever go about doing something about aging, stopping people from getting sick when they get old. And therefore, there was no idea of how soon it would happen. And if you're in that position, then you've got to find some way to put this ghastly thing out of your mind and get on with your miserably short life and, make the best of it rather than being preoccupied by this terrible thing that's going to happen to you in the future. And once you've got that far, once you've decided that you need to rationalize this out of your mind, it doesn't matter how irrational your rationalizations are, just so long as they work. Just as long as you are able to trick yourself into believing that aging is some kind of blessing in disguise, or else that it's so, intrinsically woven into the fabric of the universe that it's inherently off limits to medicine forever. So it's only now that we have an actual plan that no longer makes sense and that we need to wake people up out of the pro-aging trance.
How has the media changed? Do they treat you differently now that things have come along and there's a lot of supporting evidence?
So I wouldn't really want to say I was in it from the beginning. Cynthia Kenyon came before me and Michael Rose came before Cynthia, and they were going out there being, courageous about this. But yeah, I mean, certainly, it was pretty bad when I did get going in the early 2000s, when the media started paying attention to me. It has got a lot better. Things have definitely progressed. Even back then, the media treatment was relatively courteous. It was also somewhat, written for entertainment more than education of the audience. These days, that's only slightly true. Mostly people understand that this is for real. Of course, it helps that it's not just me going out there now, that a lot of other very credentialed scientists are doing the same, or at least doing something like the same, if not quite as optimistically as me in general. So yeah, it's completely different, but it's not good enough. There's still far too much, trying to make it seem like it's science fiction. One thing that particularly gets my goat is that journalists will, I feel deliberately, use the word death when they mean aging, or they'll even use the word old age when they mean aging. In case they hadn't noticed, old age is not something that we want to do anything about. It's something that we want to enhance, right? So yeah, that definitely annoys me, and it's still very common in the media. But in general, it is a lot better than it was.
I have seen you mentioning about timeline, about how things are going to change. You were very precise on the timeline, and you were saying how this is sort of getting fixed. You talked about two timeline. One is in one of your 2020 interviews where you said in 3 to 5 years time there will be a lot of change in public consciousness on longevity, and he said that change will come about in a very short time. I'm already seeing that people are actually aware of longevity, which was a loony idea 3 years ago when he gave that interview. And second thing is, you also talked about a date in which this will really become a practical possibility. I think that's around about 2040 or so. What are those dates looking like now?
The first one is a milestone that I have called robust mouse rejuvenation. And the second one is a milestone that I've called longevity escape velocity, LEV, which is, of course, the name of my new foundation, LEV Foundation. So for robust mouse rejuvenation, this is something where I first started talking about it maybe 20 years ago. And I said I thought we'd probably get there in about 10 years from that time, so long as we had enough money to do the relevant research. Of course, we didn't get enough money, so it's not really a surprise that we slipped. And also, of course, I was always very careful to be probabilistic about that prediction. I said that we've got at least a 50-50 chance of getting there within 10 years. Now, however, I do feel, as you say, that we're only maybe 3 years away from there, with again 50-50 probability. We've lost a couple of years on account of COVID and some of the things that I've been through, but honestly, it's we're doing all right. We're the huge combination mouse rejuvenation experiment that we're doing in Syracuse at the moment is really the way it's going to be done. We're going to be able to achieve an extension of mouse lifespan by, I'm going to say, at least a year and a half, by a bunch of combination treatments, even when those treatments are only initiated when the mice are already in middle age, like a year and a half old. That's the key thing. We want to be able to actually demonstrate rejuvenation of mice that are not very far away from starting to show actual functional decline associated with old age. The other milestone, longevity escape velocity, is for humans, and it's the point at which we start being able to postpone the biological age of people, which is to say the amount of damage in their bodies, faster than time is passing, faster than the damage is being laid down. And when I started talking about that prediction, that was 20 years ago as well. And I said, I think it's probably 25 years from now. 10 years ago, I was still saying basically, probably 20 to 25 years. So we had basically hardly got anywhere. But over the past 10 years, because of all the progress that's been made in the laboratory and in the clinic, things have moved a lot faster. And I now think that we really are probably within 12 to 15 years from that. So in other words, there's basically been almost no slippage during the past 10 years, even though there was a lot of slippage in the previous 10.
Aubrey, can you tell us about LEV, the LEV Foundation? This will be also really new to a lot of people. This is exciting.
Yeah, sure. So actually, I don't call it the LEV Foundation. I call it the LEV Foundation. I just think it's an acronym, right? So basically, we are a progression from my previous foundation at the Sense Research Foundation, which of course still exists. Historically, for the past 10 or 15 years, my focus has been on individual projects that are aimed to repair or obviate this or that type of damage, individual types of damage. And these projects we worked on because they were, very early stage. People really didn't know how to go about this. And we were the only people with the privilege, really, on account of having our funding come from philanthropy, to be able to work on things that were really difficult without necessarily getting lots of publications or, intellectual property or anything. And that was, of course, quite successful and still is. But at some point when some of those, perhaps the easier of those individual projects, have been taken forward to the point where they actually really work, at least in mice, then we are at the point of being able to go to the next step in the damage repair concept, which is to combine those things, to do a whole bunch of different things to the same mice at the same time, and obtain, much bigger benefits than what can be obtained from any single one of those interventions on its own. So the main work that we're doing at LEV Foundation is exactly that. We have a project in Syracuse at one of our spin-out companies from the Sense Research Foundation, ICOR Life Sciences, a bunch of absolutely heroic people there, fantastic company. And late last year, I bought 1,000 mice, which were delivered there on, I think, the 28th of December. And in late February of this year, we started the experiment. I'm putting updates about it out on social media every couple of weeks. So we will see where that goes. Of course, we don't know that it's going to succeed. We chose 4 promising interventions, including telomerase gene therapy, of course. But we will want very much to kick off another similar experiment with another 1,000 mice using different interventions to see what happens with those. We'll probably do quite a few of those. Basically as many as we can afford, because these experiments are very expensive. They cost $3 million a pop, at least. But yeah, that's what we're doing. Of course, we are not restricting ourselves to that at LEV Foundation. At the moment, we're already funding certain advocacy initiatives, not least the Healthspan Action Coalition, which is a terrific patient advocacy effort led by the amazing Bernie Siegel and Melissa King. We're also funding a lobbying group called the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, and we've seed funded various other things, including a cryonics company called Kynice. So yeah, we're quite diverse, and on the science side, we will probably also in due course be kicking off the more open-ended projects that were more characteristic of what happened at Sense Research Foundation.
Aubrey, you mentioned about Cynthia's research, and Cynthia Keaton's research did not translate the mouse study into human study. So a lot of people thought that calorie restriction is going to be the magic potion that would make everybody age slower and substantially slower. It did not immediately translate to human life. What is your opinion about it, Aubrey?
Yeah, so this is actually very well understood these days. And honestly, it was really pretty well understood even in Cynthia's time. So it was kind of swept under the carpet a little bit. And, I actually took the trouble to write a paper in, I think, 2004, explaining what the problem was because nobody else had. But basically, yes, the thing is that calorie restriction extends life because it is evolutionarily valuable for metabolism to respond to calorie restriction, to shortage of calories in the environment, in the real world, in the wild. All species have evolved the ability to respond to famine in this way. And different species have somewhat different approaches to how they do it, and they certainly have different reasons to do it. But mostly it comes down to, if you are in a famine, there's not much point in having offspring because your offspring will die before they have their own offspring because they won't have enough food. So it's better to hunker down and try to outlast the famine and then have your offspring afterwards. However, what that means is that short-lived species like nematode worms that Cynthia worked on are going to be likely, in general, to have a much more dramatic, much more impressive response to calorie restriction than long-lived species are, simply because famines are a function of the weather. They are not a function of the longevity of the species that experience the famine. So, and long famines are just less frequent than short famines, right? So basically, there is a length of famine that is sufficiently rare that evolution doesn't bother trying to maintain machinery to respond to it. It's only short famines that evolution has taken the trouble to respond to. But still, short is relative to the lifespan of the organism. So, you can make a worm live 5 times longer than it normally does just by starving it in the right way during the right part of its life cycle. Whereas you can only make a mouse live maybe 50% longer than it normally does. And you can only make a dog live maybe 10% longer than it normally does. And for monkeys, it's like 2 or 3% if you're lucky. So this is actually, well understood now. And of course, it's not just calorie restriction itself that I'm talking about here. It's also the drugs that mimic calorie restriction, that trick the body into thinking it's in a famine when it isn't. So the best of these at this point, I think we can all say, is rapamycin and perhaps the analogs of it that various people have been developing. These are drugs that are quite capable of making animals live pretty much as long as they would if they were in actual calorie restriction. And that's great, but you'll never get a calorie restriction mimetic to cause any animal to live longer than it would live, not much longer anyway, than it would live under calorie restriction, simply because all you're doing with these mimetics is activating the same changes to our gene expression profile, to our metabolism, that calorie restriction itself does. We don't know how much impact any of these drugs had on human longevity, but we do know that in mice, it depends, of course, when you start the study, what age, but it gives, in the same region as what actual calorie restriction gives. In fact, that's how rapamycin shot to fame back in 2011 or so. The NIH did an experiment which they were intending to do starting at like 6 months of age, and they ended up, for reasons of difficulty of formulating the chow, they ended up starting at 20 months of age. And still they got a very good effect, a very good positive result. And that's why everyone started getting terribly excited about rapamycin.
How well do these animal model studies translate to humans?
Yeah, so of course it's been known for many, many years that the translation from mice to humans in drug discovery, it has a very low hit rate. At the end of the day, I guess we shouldn't be too surprised at that. But of course, we still know that if something works in mice, then even if it's not necessarily likely to work in humans, it's more likely to work in humans than if it doesn't even work in mice, right? So but that's why people still do mouse work. Also, I think it's fair to say that damage repair interventions are more likely to translate from one species to another than interventions that involve messing with metabolism, simply because we've got the same kind of damage. It's kind of like it's just much more likely to be effective.
We hear a lot about immortal jellyfish and is it the Qui-Gon clan that lives 500 years and lobsters that'll live enormous time spirit periods. Can we actually learn something from them? I mean, do you believe in sort of like the plug and play of like programming aging by the code of DNA?
So, I mean, clearly the rate of aging is overwhelmingly determined by our genes, because if it were not, then all species would have the same lifespan. Um, Within a species, when everybody's got almost exactly the same genes, the contribution of the differences between individuals of the same species is a lot less. But your question was about other species. So what can we learn? Well, it depends how far away you go, first of all. If you go down to things like jellyfish, I mean, they're immortal, yeah, but they don't maintain their central nervous system. They, like Teratopsis, regresses to being a polyp, and, its central nervous system is dissolved in the process. And, I'm quite fond of my central nervous system, so I'd rather not have that. Um, Similarly, something like lobsters, or indeed clams, here we've got species which are more advanced, but they have this enormous advantage that they grow throughout their adulthood. They grow throughout life. And that's an advantage because it means that all of their organs, including their nervous system, their hearts, and so on, have to maintain the ability to generate new cells, because the number of cells in the organ grows if the organism grows, right? And that means that if they've got the ability to make new cells, then they've also got the ability to replace cells that are sick. So the cells that are sick do not need to survive against, at all costs, which is what happens in the brain and the heart. You've got very, very robust mechanisms for allowing cells to be long-lived, but those mechanisms are only finitely capable of maintaining cellular longevity, and we've lost the ability to replace those cells. So, it's possible that we could get that ability back by looking at how, lobsters replace neurons, for example. But I think it's probably going to be easier to do so by looking at how developing humans replace neurons or cardiomyocytes or whatever it is. Now, there are other species where the chances are a little bit better. So a good example would be naked mole rats. They have this curious molecule called hyaluronic acid, or, well, to be more precise, hyaluronic acid itself is not curious at all, but the variant of it that they have is curious. It's very long. And this seems to be extremely effective in protecting them against cancer, among other things. So various people are looking at that result and trying to understand how it might be translated therapeutically.
The genes of light-sensing algae have already been put through clinical trials in humans in 2016. Do you foresee a future where we'll start using the genes of other species?
I do. I think the one particularly important type of other species that we may end up using genes from is bacteria. Because in bacteria, we have an enormous amount of diversity, especially in terms of the ability to break things down, essentially to get energy out of them. And indeed, there's a whole commercial discipline called bioremediation, which is based on this. Because if you want to get rid of an organic pollutant from the environment, you can find bacteria that will just do it for you, and you can just put them in the polluted land, in large amounts, and the pollution goes away. This is not just an academic idea; it's very much a thriving commercial discipline. So I actually suggested back in 2000 that maybe we could use this same phenomenon therapeutically, not by injecting bacteria into the body, but by identifying the genes that they have that allow them to destroy certain molecules that we might want to destroy. This is a gene therapy that it would very much be taking something from another species. And there's lots of complications to do with making sure that, the proteins are glycosylated correctly and things like that. But it's something that I've been pursuing for quite a while with various of my projects. Some of those projects have gone quite well. There's one on macular degeneration that I believe may be sold to Big Pharma fairly soon. So, it's a plausible way to go.
That's exciting. If you were using bacterial DNA, would you want to integrate it into the mitochondria, or is that just completely like off target? I mean, where would you put it, or would you just put it in as an episome?
It'd be a lot more complicated putting it into the mitochondria. I think basically either episomal or integrated into the nuclear genome would be the way to go, depending on what vectors. Obviously, there's a huge amount of research still going on to improve the quality of the vectors that we have available, both integrating and non-integrating, and that's a separate thing from what their cargo is going to be.
It's very exciting. Sorry, you're the engineer. What do you think?
I will give a little bit of background of where we are coming from to Aubrey before I ask the next questions. So, Aubrey, basically, I'm an engineer. I've started a company which helps people reverse chronic diseases. While people are clawing over broken glass to beat their diseases, they have a huge resistance to think that I want to be able to beat my disease 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. What kind of impact society will have when someone like yourself get to do your work for another 30 years or 40 years? And when people get to live much longer, what kind of an economic impact that will have? What kind of changes in social setting that will have?
With regard to preventative medicine in general, I think you're absolutely right. It's an extraordinarily hard sell. Very, very difficult to get people to be interested in medical treatments that will stop them from getting sick unless they're already sick. Now, honestly, that's not very surprising because the fact is, everybody knows that medicine is basically black magic, especially experimental new medicine. And so it is kind of reasonable for people to feel, well, okay, if I'm not yet sick and if there's a chance that this new medicine might actually do me harm, then the cost, the risk-benefit ratio is not very attractive. And we have to get people out of that mindset, but I don't have any good ideas for how to do that, I'm afraid. The second thing I want to say in relation to part of what you said is with regard to timeframes, how far in the future people need to look. And here, it's actually not about thinking about what you would do when you're 150 or how you're going to live 50 years from now. The main reason is that we haven't the faintest idea what our options are going to be because there's all these other technologies, that come along all the time. We just got no idea what the world's going to be like even 20 years from now. So it's completely crazy to have opinions about whether one wants to be there, per se. However, one certainly can say something very much more fundamental, which is that no one's going to want ever to get sick, to be sick. No one's going to want to be sick, however long ago they were born. That's the key point. And so, we definitely know that these therapies are going to be rather popular when they arrive. But a very important aspect of this is, in terms of lifespan, is not how long you're going to live or how long you've already lived, but rather how long you think you're going to live, how long you think you're likely to live. If you ask somebody today how long they think they're likely to live, then they'll say, maybe 80, 85, 90, depending on, rate of progress. They won't think beyond that. But these medicines, when they come along, are going to change that very abruptly. People who are in their 30s or 40s or 50s are going to suddenly go from one day thinking they're going to live to 90, and the next day they're going to realize that they've got a good chance of living indefinitely.
Right.
And they're going to want, different pension plans and different life insurance and health insurance policies and different inheritance arrangements and everything. It's going to completely fucking blow the whole world global economy to kingdom come. And I've been saying this to people, when I get invited to give talks at banks and, building societies and insurance companies and so on. I give talks with titles like Anticipate the Anticipation, which is what it's about, right? Those companies are going to be the ones who have to actually be ready with the new products that are going to be wanted by people who have suddenly woken up thinking they're going to live a lot longer than they previously thought they were going to. So that's a really important aspect. And then the third thing I want to mention, the last thing, is the impact of other technologies. So it's extraordinarily seductive when thinking about some dramatic change to the human condition, like, for example, there's no more aging anymore, to think about the world in which that has happened in a manner that essentially assumes that everything else is still the same. That we've still got work and we've still got climate change and so on and so forth. And, it's completely insane. I mean, the idea that we would have to worry about, how will we pay the pensions? It's just like, hello, even really conservative organizations like the UN are saying that, more than half the jobs that exist today won't exist 10 years from now or 15, good of automation.
How long do you think you will live, or do you just not want to die today?
All I need to know is that I don't want to get sick. I'm extremely unlikely ever to want to get sick. And the less I get sick, the less likely I am to die anytime soon. Therefore, it kind of, it's not about longevity. Longevity is a side effect of health.
What do you think the science is going to look like? Is it going to look for you, no matter how long you live, that we're going to be trying to beat some aging associated issue? Or do you think that we'll get on top of it? And if so, if we were able to get on top of aging, you're a solutionist. What would be the next thing you would want to work on? Or do you just not bother thinking about that?
I don't really bother thinking about it simply because I don't know how soon we're going to get there. I am, the kind of person, as you say, who likes to work on big problems. But honestly, I have no idea what the big problem would be, the next one, because I don't know how soon it would be. I would be able to move away from this one.
Do you think that some of the interventions now, like what I see in animal studies, if they translated, or let's even hope they were even better for humans than they are for mice, we could extend lifespan, but it seems like there's still a lot of problems holes that haven't been plugged. To me, it feels like we're going to be at this for a while, but that people will start to see great gains in expectation.
So it's important to understand the mathematical basis for the whole longevity escape velocity concept. Once we are able to postpone the health problems of late life by even 20 years, we are basically done. Because 20 years is such a long time in technology, including, of course, medical technology, that by the time those 20 years are elapsed, we will, with very, very high probability, have made enough subsequent refinements to the therapies we had, the first generation ones, that we'll be able to extend the lives of the same people by another 20 years or 30 years or 50 years. And again, after that. And it gets easier over time because the residual, really difficult damage that we can't yet repair becomes more and more slight and takes longer and longer to get to the point of being pathogenic. So, yeah, I mean, it's absolutely certain that once we get to longevity escape velocity, this point where we're postponing aging faster than time is passing, that we will never fall back below it. There will be a point that one of my friends called the Methuselarity, where we get to that. It's also quite important to recognize that for short-lived animals, it's harder to reach longevity escape velocity. It's, we might, if we really try hard, we might get to longevity escape velocity for cats and dogs. There's no way in the world we'll ever get there for mice, just because the rate at which we would have to improve the therapies is just far greater.
What other technologies? So, we talk a lot about technologies moving in parallel and solving other problems. Like, what other ones really excite you? Like your original love for AI and things like that. What are the other? Are there any other areas? Do you have any other hobby reading around emerging technologies, or is aging taking all of your time?
Yeah, I don't really spend much of my time on other technologies anymore. I used to, but I just don't have enough time. You're right. Yeah, within aging, of course, there's a variety of technologies already, whether it's gene therapy, cell therapy, there's lots of different things to keep up on. So there's diversity already.
Have you tried VR? But I got a VR thing and I get a little motion sickness, but it got me so excited about, just experiences. Of course, I would like to be in person with experiences, but like there are whole new worlds being created, and it's just
Yeah.
it felt amazing. I mean, it just really reminded me that things are really moving.
Yeah, I haven't actually, no. And it's quite embarrassing to say so because one of our biggest donors at Sands Research Foundation was Michael Antonov, who was the co-founder of Oculus, who was the software architect and all that. Yeah, no, I haven't.
I wanted to ask a few things about some of the parallel innovations or attempts that are being done. One is that Liz just briefly addressed. Generative AI changed a lot of things. Imagination. It may not be a new thing for you because you've been plugged into AI for more than 25 years now. But do you think that the current rate of rate of improvement in AI, particularly what GPT does, Numenta has been doing some work which is very similar to this, where they were trying to reverse engineer how cortical structures think.
It's an incredibly exciting area, and it also is incredibly scary. I mean, George Hinton resigned from Google today, saying that, he thought things were going too fast.
What do you think about the impact of things like Neuralink will have on longevity space? This is a science fiction vision where if we are able to plug chip into the head, then suddenly each head will become like a supercomputer and we'll be able to solve a lot of problems, including aging itself. Of course, the people who propose this are clearly saying this is a science fiction territory. They're not claiming it to be something that will really come through. But you, as a person who's been doing research in all these areas for a long time, understand technology so much better. What do you think about it, Aubrey? How real these things are?
So brain-computer interfaces are, of course, a concept that's been around for a while, and various people have gone about improving them, essentially in terms of their bandwidth. In fact, one of the most exciting things that happened recently hasn't been announced yet, but I think I'll pre-announce it for you, is that Brian Johnson's company, Kernel, have finished building their wearable fMRI machine that basically will really change what brain-computer interfaces are all about. So yeah, I mean, of course, there's a variety of ways that these things can be used, especially if you can use them bidirectionally, so that you can essentially have an extracorporeal second brain that's doing a whole bunch of stuff and communicating with the natural brain. And some people talk about that as a route to uploading, though I'm not really sure it is. Depending on what you think about the continuity of identity and things like that, these philosophical questions that I never get into. But yeah, I mean, it's very exciting work. And in terms of its therapeutic value, to augment, for example, the brains of people with Alzheimer's who have progressively lost function, there's definite potential there.
Wearable fMRI sounds very interesting. What do you do with a wearable fMRI?
You wear it, you put it on your head, and it records what your brain's doing.
It measures electrical signals that are passing, and so helps us better understand. I mean, is the original studies were like in brain metabolism, right? You could basically see where you're cooking more sugar in your brain or whatever, however you like to say that. It would light up in the areas that were most active.
Yeah.
And I suppose that this will do the same. I think actually it'll have incredible readouts for meditation as well. Actually, you were part of solving a really important mathematical problem like 2 years ago.
It's actually 5 years ago. Time flies, huh?
Oh,
But yeah, I thought, I solved a problem that had been around for 68 years. It was a fluke.
Can you describe it? I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I was amazed.
Okay, so the best way I know to describe this is as a game. Okay, two players, right? And they alternate turns in all the way. The playing surface is just a piece of paper that is initially empty, initially blank. Okay. Now the rules are different for the two players. Player one has a black pen, all right? And player two has initially just one colored pen. Let's call it red, okay? But as time goes on, player two gets more pens, right? So the rules of the game are as follows. The player one has to put dots down on the piece of paper in such a way that player two can't move. So what does moving mean for player two? What it means is coloring the last dot that player one just put down with one of the pens that player two has, right? Now, the rule is that player two is not allowed to color the latest dot with the same color that they already used for a previous dot that's exactly an inch away. That's the rule. So, in other words, if it's more than an inch, fine. If it's less than an inch, fine. If it's exactly an inch, you can't use the same color. So then, player one starts, puts a dot down. Player two has only the red pen, colors it red. Player two simply puts down a second dot exactly an inch away. Game over. Player two can't move because can't use the red pen, doesn't have any other pens. So we move to round two, where player two gets an additional pen, a blue pen, right? So then player one starts and puts a dot down. Player two, let's say they color it red. Player one puts a second dot an inch away. Player two colors it blue because it can't color it red, right? And then player one obviously puts a third dot down that's in a triangle, right? An inch away from both the others, right? So, of course, then again, player one wins because player two can't play. So then player two gets a third pen, a green pen. And the question is, can player one put some dots down in a manner that, again, eventually causes player two not to be able to move? And it turns out that's quite easy. I mean, it's not quite easy enough for me to be able to describe it without pen and paper, but it only takes 7 dots. Trust me. Right?
Oh yeah, because they're gonna be 1 inch, but then at some point you've got 3 colors, so you're only working on one triangle, and so they can use the third one, the third color.
It's not quite that simple, but something like that, yes.
I'm trying to figure it out. I've got to actually play it.
Anyway, so everything I just told you so far was worked out in 1950 when people first thought, hey, this might be an interesting kind of problem. Everything I've told you so far was worked out by 1950. Another thing that was worked out was that if player two has 7 pens, then there is definitely no way that player one can ever win, however many dots, millions, billions of dots, right? There's a trick that you can play, basically a kind of cheat sheet. You can say, well, depending on where the dot is, I color it this, and so you can definitely show that 7 pens is always enough. But that leaves the question of whether 4, 5, or 6 pens is enough, right? And what I was able to show was that 4 pens are not enough, that player one can win even if player two has 4 pens. My original solution had 1,500 dots. People have got it down to 500 and something now. But yes, lots of dots.
Wow. That sounds fantastic. Is that an algorithm? Like, do you actually have it like in a computing algorithm that people can run and see it? I mean, that seems like that would be writable.
Well, I wrote it up as a mathematical paper. The way I found the solution was a combination of thinking and computing. But yeah, basically it's like, it was a computer-assisted proof.
Interesting. That's very cool.
There is something that's been in the news about a year or two ago, which was about some $250 million that Jeff Bezos invested in a longevity foundation. And every now and then you keep hearing about a billionaire throwing some money into some longevity research. I hear about it when the money is invested, but then subsequently 1, 2, 3 years down the line, you don't hear anything at all about it. Are there any progresses that are being made that is worth counting?
Yes, but it's complicated. The thing about companies is they don't tend to talk when they don't need to. when they're not raising money. So, for example, Calico was created in 2014, I think, and they never say anything about what they're doing, because they don't need to. They've got enough money, they're not raising. We're hoping that Altos, the company that Jeff Bezos funded, will not be quite so secretive. There's certainly a lot more very prominent scientists there, and they seem to be, people seem to be letting them go to conferences and talk about their work. So that seems pretty good. But there's surely going to be some restrictions on what they can say. Yes, it was much more than 250 million that Jeff Bezos put in. It was more like 3 billion. And then there are other companies, Retro, which got 180 million from Sam Altman. And of course, there's been quite a lot in the non-profit space as well, though, it's still a little more unclear where it's going. Hevolution is the big daddy of them all that says it's going to spend $1 billion a year, but it certainly isn't spending that yet. Some of these companies and organizations talk about what they're doing, but even most of them don't talk about what they're doing the way I do. The way one can when one's money comes entirely from philanthropy. People who pay me to do stuff. They want me to be talking about it all the time, and not be waiting to publish or to patent things or whatever. So I'm in a very privileged situation that way, I guess.
Well, I think that this has been a fantastic podcast. Is there anything else that you want to talk about? You want to talk about the conference in Ireland?
Sure, absolutely. So, of course, I've been running conferences for 20 years now. They are a huge part of how I've been able to do so well in terms of community building. Of course, the first time I met you, Liz, was at one of my conferences back in Cambridge in England in 2013. And then there were a few in California, and then there were a couple in Berlin, and now we're doing them in Dublin. So the first Dublin conference was last September. It was a blowout success. You spoke there, if I remember rightly. This year again, we are doing it in August 17th to 20th. Honestly, the lineup this time is, I'm going to say it's definitely the most illustrious speaking roster I've ever been able to put together. In fact, arguably, it's the most illustrious that anyone's ever been able to put together. I've got absolutely everybody. And it's going to be a blast, of course.
I can't wait. And so definitely we want people to get tickets to that and get out there, come down, meet all of these people. David Kekich, somebody who we both really loved, always said, you come and meet your best friends. These are like people fighting for your life that you never even knew existed.
That is right.
Yeah. Right. So thank you for being here. It was absolutely fabulous. And as you have more news to share with LEV, we hope that you come and give us some of that news on this podcast so that we can get it out to emerging people. And we're definitely global. And so we want to share the love with everyone.
Absolutely right. Marvelous. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much from my side. Thank you.